Good afternoon, YouTube, and welcome back to the Suburban Proletarian. My name is Greg, and today's video is going to be the latest installment in my Proletarian Watches of the World series. And the subjects of today's video are probably the most proletarian watches of all time. They are certainly the most ubiquitous and least expensive real watches on today's marketplace. And of course, I'm talking about Casio 3-button digitals. And of course, the most iconic, the most emblematic of the Casio 3-button digitals is the F-91W. Everyone knows the F-91W. Even if you don't know the name, you're very familiar with its face. It's one of the most recognizable watches in the world. Right up there with, I know I'm going to catch flack for this, but right up there with something like the Rolex Submariner. You may not know that the Rolex Submariner is called the Rolex Submariner, but almost anybody can look at it and go, that's a Rolex. Same thing with the Casio F-91W. And I've been preparing for this video for a while, and it's been tough. I'm still sitting here not really knowing what I'm going to say. It's been covered everywhere. So much ink has been spilled and so much HTML code written and so many hours of video dedicating to extolling the virtues and pointing out the deficiencies of the F-91W. I don't really know what I can say about it here that hasn't been said a million times elsewhere. But the fact is, the F-91W, I own a lot of watches. Let's be honest about that. I own more watches than I care to admit. And I tend to own fairly inexpensive watches, very proletarian watches, hence the name of this channel. But the F-91W is by far the cheapest watch I own. Well, it's pretty much the cheapest watch I own. And it finds its way onto my wrist more often than any other watch. And so I thought probably the best way to approach this video is, what is the reason for that? And the reason for it is very simple. All of the virtues and the deficiencies of the F-91W can be boiled down, condensed into one basic statement. What can you say about the F-91W that can't be said about any other watch made today? It has to be some sort of record status that can't be beaten. And there's really only one thing about the F-91W. And the fact is, it is the most replaceable watch on the planet. It's the only watch that I can think of that if you lost it, or broke it and needed to replace it pretty much anywhere in the world, you could do so certainly within 24 hours. I think more often than not, in places like the United States or other developed countries, you could probably replace this watch within the hour. I could leave here right now and buy a brand new one and bring it back here within 15 minutes. What other watch can you say that of? Guaranteed. Almost anywhere in the world. You could probably blindfold me, put me in a helicopter, fly me and drop me in some metropolitan area anywhere in the world, totally unknown to me. And I'm going to guess that I could lay my hands on an F-91W in under an hour. So there just isn't any, there's no other watch that you could say this about. The F-91W crosses all socioeconomic and geographic and political barriers. It's been photographed on the wrists of such disparate characters as Barack Obama and Osama bin Laden. You have as good a chance of seeing it on the wrist of a fisherman working his nets out of a dugout canoe in some far-flung backwater in the world as you do in the case of Michael Schumacher, glued to the middle of the steering wheel in a multi-million-dollar Formula One race car as a rudimentary timing device. It's just everywhere. And a lot of people love it, a lot of people hate it, but you can't ignore the fact that it's probably the most important watch being produced today. That's just a fact. And if you don't like it, or you don't agree with me, feel free to comment down below, but I don't think it can be disputed. But the F-91W is not alone. There are other Casio 3-button digitals, quite a few of them. One of the other really iconic ones is the Japanese domestic market only Casio F-84W, which is very, very similar in many, many ways. We'll talk about that. It's different in almost every possible way. There are very few two parts on these two watches that are exactly the same, but they're alike enough to be almost indistinguishable. Very strange. I don't know. We'll talk about that. And there are other watches based on the same module. Here's one called the W216H, which is a little bit fancier, but it's basically an F-91W in a fancy skin. So in just a moment or two, we're going to move over to the tabletop and talk about all these watches and point out some similarities and differences. But before we do that, of course, we've got to do our customary wristwatch check. And today, in keeping with the proletarian theme of this channel and today's video, I am wearing a Pulsar, and I don't even know what the model name for this is. I've had it for several years. Pulsar is an underappreciated brand. Most of you might know that it is a sub-brand of Seiko, and most Pulsars really seem to emulate earlier Seiko models. It's almost like Seiko makes a watch, and it's not really being sold very well. It's not selling very well, and it's not kind of maybe up to Seiko's standards. So it just gets downgraded, rebranded as a Pulsar, and sold that way. I'm actually pulling what I call a Suburban Schwarzkopf today. I've got my little Seiko 5 on the other hand, just to show exactly how similar these two watches are. This is a general layout, a basic design structure that has proven very successful for Seiko. These stainless steel, they're not quite casual as a sports watch or a field watch, not quite dress watches. I call them basic business watches. And it's been a very successful pattern for Seiko and its sub-brands Pulsar, and for other companies as well. But I look at watches like this, which is I think this watch is about 32 years old. This watch is about 2 years old. This one's quartz, this one's automatic. And they're clearly different, but from a distance, from 20 feet away, they'd be virtually indistinguishable. What they bring to mind for me is if you went to any backyard barbecue in any middle class to upper middle class suburban neighborhood in the 1970s and the 1980s, and you sought out the picnic table where all the guys were sitting discussing the fine points of formulating and grilling hamburgers while drinking Budweiser out of cans, 9 out of 10 wrists would have, well, 9 out of 10 left wrists, or right wrists, whatever, would have had a watch very similar to this on them. I mean, these are the watches our fathers grew up with, the watches I kind of grew up with, and although they're kind of nondescript and not very interesting, they hold a certain fascination for me. Very serviceable, very straightforward. They don't grab a lot of attention, but they're still attractive. The Pulsar is actually, well, it's a quartz, and the Seiko's an automatic. This one has a 30-meter water rating. This is actually improved in some ways. It's got a 100-meter water resistance rating. I don't know. What can I say about these watches? They're boring and yet very good, and they tend to be small, low profile. The Seiko sits a little higher off the wrist than the Pulsar because this is a quartz and this is an automatic mechanical movement, but they're both fairly unobtrusive. I've worn these with suits. I've worn them working in the machine shop, running a milling machine. You know, they pretty much will go anywhere and do anything. Not unlike these Casio watches, which is what you actually came here to see. So without any further ado, let's go do it. All right, guys, so here they are. We've got a pretty representative selection of Casio 3-button digitals. Of course, the F-91W, with which we are already all so familiar. Its Japanese domestic market equivalent, the F-84W. And this is a model called the W216H. It's mostly here to illustrate the fact that very similar electronic modules as appear in these basic watches have been installed in a number of other watches that mostly are just cosmetic upgrades to the original. Some have slightly substantive improvements. This watch, for instance, boasts a water resistance rating of 50 meters, whereas each of these is simply called water resistant, which if you press Casio, they'll give you a number of 30 meters, but then go on to tell you that you really shouldn't get these wet at all, not even washing your hands or doing the dishes, or certainly not taking a shower or swimming. Having said that, I've owned probably 10 to a dozen F-91Ws or F-84W. Well, this is probably the only F-84W I've owned, but this model or similar models like this one, over the course of the last 30 years or so, I've gone swimming with every single one I've ever owned, and I've had failures, I've had them just die, I've lost them over the years. I've never ever had one get water inside the case, but ostensibly these are 30-meter watches, both of these, whereas Casio puts it, they're just water resistant, basically just for walking in the rain. This one you could probably do a little bit of swimming with. In all honesty, you could swim with any three of these watches, I think, without a whole lot of fear. But watches like the W216H don't really represent any significant technological upgrades over these basics. It just looks a little bit sportier. It was put in a little flashier case and given a bit of extra water resistance, and sells for approximately the same price as these watches. So what's the story behind the Casio 3-button digital? Well, when Casio first started making digital watches in the 1970s, they were, very much like watches from other manufacturers, mostly 4-button watches. A couple of the early watches were 2-button watches, I believe, but most of Casio's watches were 4 buttons with a separate button for the light, a function, a mode button, a mode switching button, and 2 function buttons. Some featured a recessed set button and 2 function buttons. There were different models, but they were all generally 4-button models, and the 3-button model, I think the first one to come out was the F-85 in, I believe, 1981. I think this was the first 3-button model. It had 2 function buttons on the side and a recessed setting or mode button over here. That came out in 1981. And the 3-button models proliferated during the 1980s. The F-91W, as the name sort of suggests, was introduced in 1991 and has gone on in, I think, uninterrupted production for the additional, whatever that is, 28 years, 27 years. The F-84W did not similarly come out in 1984. I think it was introduced in 1990, so it only predates the F-91W by 1 year, and seems to indicate that the numeric value in the model name really doesn't correspond to a year. It just happened to work out that way with the F-91W. So the 3 buttons were basically a simplification. They combined the light button, which is up here, and just illuminates a very small incandescent bulb that you can see on the side there. That also has some other functions, whereas on 4-button watches, the light button basically was just a light button. And there's no recessed set button on here. To get into the setting section, you would scroll using the mode selection button through the various functions, and when you get to the last screen, you're just automatically in the settings screen, and then you can toggle back to the time. So these are really very basic. As I said, you've got the time clearly there, and the date and day of the week. You've got a single alarm and a stopwatch, which starts and stops right here. Resets using the light button, as I said. So it's funny, the light will come on when you reset the stopwatch. But this was just a matter of simplifying production. There's fewer places for water to get into the case. Certainly makes the watches cheaper. Casio watches are generally thought of as being fairly cheap, except the really high-end models, but they weren't that cheap. Back in the early 1980s, you would probably have paid more for a similar watch than you would pay today to purchase one of these. The F-91W, you know, it can be had in various places around the globe for less than $10. I paid less than $10 for this one on Amazon. I paid a bit more for the F-84W. There's nothing particularly special about it, but it's only for sale in Japan. Other than the fact that it's only available in Japan, it's essentially identical to the F-91W. It functions exactly the same way. It has the same little green light. At quick glance, it's virtually indistinguishable from the F-91W. But having said that, and it does use the same module, both of these watches use the Casio's 593 module. But other than the module and maybe these buttons on the side, despite the fact that these are very, very, very similar in every style and dimension, no two parts are exactly the same. And I don't think Casio's ever explained why they do this. I don't know that anyone knows why they do it other than Casio, but this watch is only available in Japan. This watch is available everywhere else. They're very, very, very similar and completely different at the same time. Who knows why? But these are very highly counterfeited, despite the fact that they're ubiquitous and cheap. They're easy to counterfeit, and the counterfeits apparently sell well all over the world. So Casio's done a few things to make it a little bit harder to pass a counterfeit watch off as real. And one of them is if you hold this button in on the lower right for a few seconds, it shows the word Casio there. And that pretty much guarantees a genuine Casio module inside anyway. The F-84W behaves in exactly the same manner. And watches like the W216H, it does have a slightly different module. These two buttons are reversed. Obviously the display is a little bit different. The module in the W216H is, I believe, the 3435. But again, if you press this button in and hold it, you get the Casio display. So I guess ostensibly they're worried about these being counterfeited as well. Ironically, a lot of, or most of, Casio's higher-end digitals don't have that feature. There are a couple other quirky little things about these Casios. If you hold in all three buttons simultaneously, it'll activate every LED or LCD panel on the screen simultaneously. I don't think this is an anti-counterfeiting thing. I think this is some sort of a quality control or diagnostic function, and then by pressing any button it goes back to its normal state. Now these watches are manufactured in several different places. The F-91W is definitely manufactured in a Casio factory in China, as well as in Thailand. This particular model was made in Thailand. This F-84 was also made in Thailand, probably in the same factory. I don't know if the F-84W is made anywhere else than Thailand. I don't know if it's also made in China, but the Chinese models, most people agree the Chinese models and the Thai models are not particularly different. There's no real significant advantage. But nonetheless, the models made in Thailand are somewhat more desirable. I've found that they seem to exhibit a little bit better quality, a little bit better fit and finish. It may just be my imagination. The finish on the stainless steel seems a little bit better on the Thai watches over the Chinese. They seem to be built a little bit closer to the original Japanese standards if you were familiar with these watches from the 1980s when they were all made in Japan. As I was, I mean, the first 5 Casio watches I owned were probably all made in Japan. And the Thai watches just seem to hold a little bit higher standard. But as far as functionality, almost everyone agrees there's no discernible difference between Chinese and Thai. Having said that, despite the fact that these are both made in Thailand, the F-84W, if you look at the lettering on the back of the case, the final finish machining on the stainless steel, all seems to be a little bit nicer on the F-84W than the F-91W. I don't know if that's intentional. I don't know if the Japanese reserve a slightly higher grade of watch for their own market than for those they sell overseas, or if it was just a matter that these two watches were made on slightly different machinery in the same factory and they just, I don't know. Maybe the F-84 could look like the F-91 and vice versa if we were looking at different examples. I only have these two models, so I couldn't really say. But dimensionally, they're very similar. But as you can see, the cases are not the same. The F-84 has true case lugs. The F-91 doesn't. It has just this recess in the back of the case. Dimensionally, extremely similar. The band on the F-84W is slightly narrower and yet slightly longer. In America, this would almost be considered a child's watch or a woman's watch. The same complaint has actually been made about the F-91W, but it would definitely be the case in the United States with the F-84W. It seems like a woman's watch band dimensions, but these are not even... I don't think Casio even classifies these as unisex. I think they're classified as men's watches, both of them. And I've worn both of these. I don't have super huge wrists, but they're not tiny either. And I don't know. I don't really worry about watch size too much. As long as the watch fits around my wrist, I don't really worry about the dimensions too much. A lot of people get very concerned about how the watch looks on their wrist. Me, not so much. I guess, what else can I say about these watches? I don't want to drag this out too long because these have been really, really covered elsewhere. A couple other differences. There's the Casio name is on the keeper band on the F-84W, whereas it appears on the buckle on the F-91W. I don't know. I think I'm kind of grasping at straws here. I don't know there's a whole lot else I could say. They're very, very good watches. They tend to be very, very reliable. I've owned a number of this style of watch. Other than maybe a battery going dead and I just threw the watch away because it was more trouble to get a new battery than to get a new watch or something. I can't remember anything ever failing on any of these watches, and I've done everything you shouldn't do with them. I've gone swimming, I've gone snorkeling, I've taken showers, I've done the dishes, I've washed, I've cleaned the aquarium wearing these watches. I almost never take my watch off unless I know I have some watches that are absolutely not waterproof, and I do take care of those, but watches like this, I just don't worry about them too much, and I've never had one fail. I've seen a lot of complaints about these watches where the lugs break off or the band. A lot of people complain that the band won't last more than 9 months. And I'm not here to tell you how to wear your watch, how to fasten your watch, but that just seems like a case of people wearing their watches a little too tight. And some people like their watches that way. I like to wear my watch where I can insert a finger between the buckle and my wrist. I like a little bit of play there. You wear them too tight. A general good rule of thumb is if you move a watch all the way forward on your wrist, if you flex your wrist up and down like this, if you're feeling any significant amount of pressure here, the ligaments and tendons and muscles and bones in your wrist are not going to give. The band on your watch is going to give, or the case is going to give. So I think most of these broken case lugs and broken straps can be chalked up to people wearing their watches too tight. And I'm not, that's fine. If you like to wear your watch really tight, I'm not here to tell you not to do that, but I haven't had similar problems. And I've owned a number of this style of watch. They tend to be very reliable. They tend to be quite accurate. Casio gives an accuracy standard for most of their digital watches of, I think, plus or minus 1 second per day, which is not bad, but it's not great for a quartz watch. I have never experienced a Casio watch that was anywhere near as inaccurate as plus or minus 1 second per day. This F-91W is probably the least accurate Casio watch I own, and it runs at plus 0.3 of a second per day. This W216H, which I've never even taken out of the package, but I have been running against the Watch Check app on my phone since the beginning of January or so, is running at positive 0.1 of a second per day, plus 0.1 seconds per day. And this watch, which I have been timing since February 2nd of this year on my Watch Check app, has gained 2 seconds since February 2nd. Today is April 14th. Watch Check shows this watch running at plus 0.0 seconds per day. As near as makes no difference to absolutely perfect. I mean, that's quartz chronometer standards. That's less than 0.1 of a second a day is the same as a thermally compensated Grand Seiko quartz or a Citizen Chronomaster or an Omega Mega Quartz chronometer. I mean, for a watch that retails for about $10, I had to pay $14 and wait 2 months for this to come from Japan. But for the price of this watch, how could you beat that accuracy? Very accurate, even at 0.3 of a second per day. I mean, this is more than accurate enough, probably, even if you were using it for celestial navigation to sail your sailboat across the Atlantic Ocean or something. I'm sure you'd come out pretty close on target over a 2-3 week trip with this thing. What more can you ask for out of cheap plastic watches? I don't know. I know a lot of people in the watch enthusiast community hate these. At least as many people love them. Some people are ambiguous. I don't think too many. They're just great, great watches. And if anyone who doesn't own an F-91W, other than you just think it's horrible because it's too small and it looks terrible on your wrist or whatever, but I can't think of a good reason not to own one of these. This watch is on my wrist more than any other watch I own. Mostly because of what I've already pointed out is it's the most replaceable watch I own. I like wearing this watch. I've worn the F-84W a couple of times, but it tends to live inside its Japanese domestic market packaging because although it's very, very similar to the F-91W, there's nothing terribly special about it, and it's sort of cheap and plastic also. It's probably one of the least replaceable watches I own. This I could replace in 15 minutes, as I've already pointed out. This, as I've already pointed out, I paid $15, including shipping, on eBay from a seller in Japan, and I had to wait for 2 months for it to come by slow boat from Japan. It would be quite difficult. It's nothing special about it, but it would be quite difficult to replace, and I just don't wear it that much. This is not, the F-91W is rugged, but it's certainly not the most rugged watch I own. It's reliable. It's certainly not the most reliable watch I own. It's accurate, but it's definitely not the most accurate watch I own. And if I were going off in the middle of nowhere, if I were going off into the wilderness, this is not the watch I would take with me. But when I'm going to work, I'm going to be painting or using an angle grinder or running a milling machine or whatever, this is definitely the watch that ends up on my wrist the most, because if it gets destroyed, and believe it or not, I'd be bummed if this watch gets destroyed. I know the great thing about it is its replaceability, but I still get attached. I always feel bad when I lose a watch. I would be bummed if I lost or broke this watch, but if I do, it's not the end of the world. So it's a quality watch, it's accurate, it's reliable, it's durable, and if it gets destroyed, it's really not the end of the world. So I don't know. It just makes it one of the greatest watches on the planet, in my opinion. I think you could probably make a pretty convincing argument that the F-91W is the greatest watch in production today. If you disagree, tell me about it down below. Let's go back over to the bookshelves. I don't really have anything more to say about this. All right, guys, so there you have it. You know, these Casio 3-button digitals, the F-91W, the F-84W, the W216H, and other variations. They're just everywhere. That's pretty much indisputable. You might love them, you might hate them, but for better or worse, they're some of the most important watches in the world today. You may have loved this video, or you may have hated this video. If you loved it, please click the like button. If you hated it, go ahead and click the dislike button. You won't hurt my feelings. But if you enjoyed this video and you might want to see more like it in the future, please consider subscribing. As I'm sure all of you know, YouTube has disgruntled some people, clearly, by changing all the rules. If you want your channel to be monetized at all, it's all about the number of subscribers. So every subscription will go a long way to help keeping me here on YouTube. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, and it takes just a click of a button or a tap on your screen to do so, and you can always unsubscribe in the future. If you don't like me, absolutely unsubscribe. If I start to suck, you know, throw me out. That won't hurt my feelings a bit. I mean, it will hurt my feelings a bit, but it might influence me to generate better content in the future. As I said, I will be doing a more extensive review of the F-91W specifically. There isn't much more I can say about the watch and its functionality than I did here. It's pretty darn basic. But another interesting thing about this watch, which I haven't covered yet, is the fact that despite the fact that it's everywhere, and despite the fact that it's so cheap, it's also the most counterfeited watch on the planet. And it was actually, I think in third world countries, it's very hard to get a real one. In this country, it's actually pretty hard to get a counterfeit one, but I did manage to track one down, and I am waiting for it to come. And I want to compare and contrast the F-91W with its counterfeit counterpart. So that'll be coming up in a video rather soon. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope I managed to stay on the air. I hope you subscribe. And when I come back here, I hope to see all of you here again next time. Later, guys.